This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
About the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center. In the aftermath of Dick Clark's death, there's been much talk about the impact that his show, American Bandstand, had on American race relations. Today we're joined by Matthew Delmont, author of the new book, The Nicest Kids in Town, American Bandstand, Rock and Roll, and the Struggle for Civil Rights in 1950s Philadelphia, who shed some light on exactly the kind of impact that American Bandstand had on American race relations. And later we're joined by John Jennings, an animator and author of graphic novels, a professor at the University of Buffalo, who talks about the role of black bodies in comic books and that Tupac holograph. I'm Anthony Neal, and this is Left to Black. Good afternoon and welcome back to Left to Black. I'm your host, Anthony Neal. We're joined this afternoon by Professor Matthew F. Delmont, Professor of American Studies at Scripps College in California, and the author of the brand new book, The Nicest Kids in Town, American Bandstand, Rock and Roll, and the Struggle for Civil Rights in 1950s Philadelphia. How are you doing today, Matthew?
I'm good. Thank you for having me, Mark.
So let me start with this question. There's a generation of folks who have no memories of American Bandstand. Save a mentioning of it in the recent death of Dick Clark. And most of them only know Dick Clark because of New Year's Rocking Eve. Talk a little bit about why American Bandstand and at this particular time, as kind of a subject for your study.
Yeah, the way I try to explain it to my students who have no recollection of the actual American Bandstand is to remind them that when television started, it was unusual to see teenagers on television, right? Yeah. So when Bandstand came on nationally in 1957, it was really the first show that established an image of what teenagers looked like. And it was on every afternoon from 57 till the early 1960s, so 1963, broadcasting from Philadelphia. So I really try to emphasize that it gave the nation an image of what teenagers looked like. It really brought rock and roll and some aspects of R&B into American living rooms at a time you didn't see a lot of that on television. And also, what was interesting about it is these were just ordinary teenagers from Philadelphia. So when we think about reality television being a somewhat new phenomenon, these were ordinary teenagers who became famous in their day. They just went to the local Philadelphia high schools, but they became famous dancing on television. So it's an early story of a lot of the things we see in our contemporary popular culture.
Now, Dick Clark wasn't the first host. Can you talk about when Dick Clark gets brought into the fold and how the show changes and develops with him as kind of the face or the brand of American Bandstand?
Yeah, so actually a DJ named Bob Horn was the initial host of Bandstand. It starts as a local program in 52, and Horn hosts it until 56, and he actually gets thrown off for a drunk driving conviction while the city of Philadelphia was running an anti-drunk driving campaign. What's interesting about that, though, is Bob Horn was an older guy. So he was a DJ, but he was in his 50s when he was hosting the show with teenagers. So when they got rid of Bob Horn, this is 1956, they were looking for someone who was very young and very sort of clean cut, and that's how they ended up with Dick Clark. He's 26, 27 at the time. And it's a move to put a younger face on rock and roll, but also put a very safe face on rock and roll. Yeah. So there are a lot of protests going on across the nation with rock and roll in the 1950s. And they want to turn to someone like Dick Clark to put the cleanest, most clean-cut, safest image they could with rock and roll. So he, at the time, was a host of a small radio show in Philadelphia, and it was really his big break. So he's just in his late 20s, and he rides this opportunity to become a tremendous entrepreneur and tremendously wealthy media personality.
You're watching Left to Back, and we're joined this afternoon by Professor Matthew F. Delmont, author of the new book, The Nicest Kids in Town, American Bandstand, Rock and Roll, and the Struggle for Civil Rights in 1950s Philadelphia. We talk about this kind of clean-cut image of Dick Clark, and this goes on all throughout his career, right? He gets known as the world's oldest teenager, literally, until his death. Ryan Seacrest, kind of waiting in the fold to become the new Dick Clark, if you will.
Yeah.
But American Bandstand is not created in a vacuum, right? It is a product of a particular kind of social moment, right? It's the post-World War II period. It's the early moments of what we know as the modern civil rights movement. And American Bandstand wasn't untouched by that. You argue in the book that in some ways to understand the creation of American Bandstand, you have to understand the tensions around segregation in American society, particularly around housing and particularly around television. And you mentioned earlier, American Bandstand was shot in North Philadelphia. It was done in the community. Give a little backstory about what this North Philadelphia looks like when Dick Clark starts hosting American Bandstand in 1957.
Yeah, so it's West Philadelphia where the show is broadcast from. WFL's studio are just in a residential neighborhood in West Philadelphia. So what's interesting about trying to locate where the show is coming from is that you have to understand that that area is a site of tremendous racial tensions in the 1950s. So it's a racially diverse area. You have African Americans, you have Italians, you have Jewish folks, you have Irish Americans, all kind of intermixed in that area, but there's a lot of tensions going on as more African Americans start to move into West Philadelphia. So there are homeowners groups, as there are in many parts of the country, like places like Chicago, who are trying to block African Americans from moving into these neighborhoods. So this is just a couple blocks from Bandstand's studio. Bandstand's producers are aware of this, so they're aware of these racial tensions that are going on. At the same time, even as a local program, they're aware that they're concerned about broadcasting images of teens dancing together across racial lines into suburban communities that are themselves whites only, right? So they're aware of these racial tensions. What it means for Bandstand is they try to get the creative energies of African American culture into the studio, the music, the dance styles,
right,
without African Americans themselves, because that's going to scare off advertisers potentially and potentially scare off viewers. So it's a really fine line they're trying to walk of bringing this very vibrant youth culture and very vibrant music scene in Philadelphia to the airwaves without bringing in the potential dangers that racial interaction would have.
Right. In some ways, it's a form of whitewashing.
Certainly.
And in some ways, they're much more progressive in terms of bringing black acts onto the show than they are in terms of bringing black teens into the studio.
Definitely. So Bandstand does deserve some credit for bringing a number of African-American performers onto television, helping them sell records. In part, that's because they just couldn't fake it by the late 1950s. People, white teens and black teens, they
wanted the most authentic, right? Yeah.
Yeah, they wanted the real performers. Now, Bandstand does start to have some of the white teen idols, folks like Frankie Avalon, Fabian, who don't present the sort of the authentic picture.
Right, the classic example.
But in terms of that studio audience and the folks who are on the dance floor, there was real concern about having teens dance together across racial lines. And that's why they kept black teens out of the studio. They were concerned that it would offend advertisers and offend viewers.
And besides the issues in terms of it offending viewers, this is right after Nat King Cole's show, really as successful as it was. Folks watched it, being pulled off the air because it was unable to get kind of national sponsorship because of again, this kind of fear of offending certain white viewers. But these tensions are also very real, right? These are black and white, Jewish, Italian kids, Latino kids who are also going to school in Philadelphia public schools. And the Philadelphia public schools is also concerned about how it's going to manage this integration project. I imagine, for the city of Philadelphia, the integration is inevitable. But they still have to maintain a certain kind of, if you will, racial decorum at this point in time. And how does that affect, what Bandstand does in terms of looking at the Philadelphia school system at that time? This is where the kids are coming from and trying to kind of maintain the politics that the school system wanted at the same time.
Yeah. Thank you for asking about that. So one of the main themes of the book is trying to look at the sort of racial policies and racial politics of Bandstand in coordination with what was going on in Philadelphia public schools at the same time. Mm-hmm. So part of the story is that in both those places, both the producers of Bandstand and the Philadelphia School Board had colorblind policies or nominally colorblind policies where they'd say, we're not for segregation, we're actually for integration. It just so happens that our schools are becoming more racially segregated, and just so happens that Bandstand's dance floor is racially segregated. What happened with the schools was, as the neighborhoods would turn over, what they would do is they would build new schools in areas where they would necessarily become white-only schools. They'd build them in the suburban parts of the city where they become white-only schools, or they'd build them in the African-American parts of the city where they knew they'd become African-American schools. Yeah. They would allow transfers that were not equally available across racial lines. So schools were not ever fully segregated in the way you might see in the South, but that sort of de facto segregation really emerged over the course of the 1950s and the 1960s. And the school board did very little to counteract that. And in fact, they did everything they could to fight back against the civil rights activists. They kept saying, schools are becoming more segregated, African-American students are going to under-resourced schools. The school board kept putting out these memos saying, we're the leaders of integration in the country, right? Completely hyperbolic statements that anyone witnessed what was going on the ground would see what weren't true. But the problem for civil rights activists in Philadelphia, as it was in the North, is they couldn't find that sort of smoking gun evidence that would allow them to fight against de facto segregation. That's what was so hard about trying to push back against de facto segregation. Is the lines were blurry enough that you could have segregation without the ability to find legal recourse for it.
And that's one of the really important interventions that your book makes. We're talking here with Matthew Delmont, his new book, The Nicest Kids in Town, American Bandstand, Rock and Roll in the Struggle for Civil Rights in 1950s Philadelphia. But one of the important interventions that your book makes is that it looks back on this era, and we've kind of bought into this almost fantasy about what racism looked like in the South and what segregation looked like in the South, and how it was innocuous in the North, right? You know, everybody was happy, they rode buses together, they went to school together. And what your book really depicts is that, you know, even in places like Philadelphia, I mean, you mentioned this kind of colorblind politics in the school system, and I kept thinking about Boston as an example. You know, it was also always clear that there were certain neighborhoods that you wouldn't go into. You know, there's no law saying that you can't, but you knew you didn't go into those neighborhoods. And the book makes this intervention to suggest, no, this was also a struggle, a side of struggle over civil rights. One of the stories that, for instance, Dick Clark never talked about, that you talk about in the book, is the fact that black kids themselves protested in front of Bandstand Studios because they weren't allowed inside the studios to participate.
Yeah, so and this actually comes up a lot in the recent obituaries after Dick Clark's passing. So Dick Clark had always claimed that he racially integrated American Bandstand as early as 1957 when he took over the show. And it's just fundamentally not true. So I actually thought it was true when I started the project. But as I got into the archives, started looking at the materials, started interviewing people, both black teens who were excluded from the show, but also white teens who were on the show and could tell me, you know, there were not black teens on this show. Most of the obituaries for Dick Clark just repeated all of his claims. And I think part of, and just as you're saying, part of that is an amnesia about what racism looked like in the North, right? So very, very rarely African-American teens were able to get on Bandstand, but that in no means indicates the show was racially integrated, right? The show had policies that used a bunch of underhanded techniques to keep the teens off the show, and black teens were aware of this and they protested against it. So one of the most interesting examples I found in my research was during the Little Rock school integration crisis in the fall of 1957, there were teenagers in Philadelphia who saw what was going on nationally and were really upset by it. And they wanted to find something locally that they could protest. And what they chose to protest was American Bandstand. And I talked to them and they said, you know, we weren't trying to change history or anything. We just thought, you know, this is right in our own neighborhood and we can't even go to it. This is unfair. And they protest against that. And that doesn't show up. It didn't show up in Dick Clark's history of the show and didn't show up in the obituaries that tried to sort of whitewash that history of segregation on American Bandstand.
And at least for a younger audience, right, to remember that very often, you know, particularly when black artists would tour the South, you know, venues would have a couple of strategies to use to kind of maintain segregation. There'd be the whites only show and then the black only show. There'd be, you know, the whites on the floor and the black folks in the back only, you know, what Carl Van Vechten termed back in the 1920s, nigger heaven. There'd be examples of blacks on one side and whites on the other side. So in some ways, you know, American Bandstand actually had a technology that could perceive that there was much more integration going on than there actually was, particularly with the black performers on stage.
Certainly. So yeah, I mean, you have black performers on stage. What they would do to keep those black teens out of the studio is they would say, okay, you have to be wearing a certain outfit today to get on, right? And so you didn't have that right clothes on, you couldn't get on. Or
it's the American Bandstand, the American Bandstand poll tax, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this is what segregation looked like in the North, right? It was, everyone knew what was up, but it was hard to prove it because they couldn't just say, you know, we have a formal policy of segregation. They would just use these techniques to keep people off.
I think most folks would admit that if you look at the trajectory of Dick Clark's career, he was absolutely brilliant, right? Understood how to market, understand branding well before we talked about it as a term, understood his value, the value of American youth culture and him being connected to it. So when you think of the long course of his career, there's no question that he was brilliant. But in those early days, he also had to find folks who could help him navigate through what was great music, what was useful music, what the kids really liked. And you talk in particular of two black figures, Georgie Woods, you know, who's a radio host and civil rights activist in Philadelphia, and also Mitch Thomas, who's the Mitch Thomas Show. It really is a precursor to Soul Train, 15 years before Don Cornelius launches that. Talk a little bit about those two figures and also their relationship to Dick Clark.
Yeah. So Georgie Woods and Mitch Thomas are undoubtedly two of the most important, both musical musical host, but also civil rights activist in Philadelphia. They're able to sort of bridge that gap. Georgie Woods is fascinating because he really brings rock and roll and early R&B to Philadelphia when he's a radio host there. And he hosts these excellent shows at the Uptown Theater in North Philadelphia. Brings in all the sort of the biggest acts of the day, Sam Cooke, James Brown. They all come through Philadelphia. But like a number of other DJs, African-American DJs across the South and across the North, he's able to use that as a platform to raise money for and raise awareness for civil rights. So he's bringing these artists in, and for the 50 cents or dollar that people would pay, that money would go to the NAACP in Philadelphia, or would get sent to Selma to help civil rights activists in the South. He would also use his radio program to announce different civil rights protests, right? So he would get people out to protest the schools or protest working conditions. So for him, it was really an opportunity to bridge his love of music and his love of trying to improve the civil rights conditions of African Americans in Philadelphia. Mitch Thomas is fascinating. For me, I didn't actually even know about Mitch Thomas when I started this research. It was someone I discovered once I actually got into the archives. But he hosts a show that comes out of Wilmington, Delaware, a locally broadcast African-American dance show that resembles American Bandstand, except it's all African-American teenagers. So he's putting African teenagers on the air at a time he just did not see black teens on the air very often. It's locally broadcast, but this show broadcasts into the Philadelphia area. So what would happen is the Mitch Thomas show would be on Saturdays, and then that next week you'd see those dances that were on the Mitch Thomas show. You'd see those on Bandstand. So there's a great clip online of teenagers at a local show in Des Moines, Iowa, doing a dance called the Stroll, that old line dance. And the question is how they learned the Stroll, and what I argue is that they actually learned the Stroll through the Mitch Thomas show. That Mitch Thomas brought to Bandstand brought to Iowa, and those Iowa teens, they didn't know they learned it from Mitch Thomas, but they learned it from the Mitch Thomas show.
And that's an important aspect also if you look at the impact of American Bandstand, right? It put into motion the notion of a national American youth culture. Right. Suddenly these things, like, I mean, this is a show that's very localized. I mean, you mentioned in the book, even if, Bandstand and their producers were a little concerned about race, they did put, white, ethnic, working class communities on the front page, right? So suddenly, comparing it to, say, Fathers Knows Best, in which you had no sense of the ethnicity, Dick Clark and the producers were very clear about, we're coming out of these Italian-American enclaves, and we're going to celebrate that at a time where there was still even some resistance to them being really recognized in the context of American culture.
Yeah, certainly. So some of the most prominent teens that show up on the show are Italian-American teens. They're just teens from South Philadelphia and West Philadelphia. And when I talked to them, they talked about how important it was for them to get this recognition nationally, that they felt like as Italian-Americans in Philadelphia that they felt discriminated against in many cases. Yeah. And that for them to get this recognition, to be the face of American youth culture was really important. It helped to sort of Americanize them in some ways.
You're watching Left of Black. We're joined this afternoon by Matthew Delmont and talking about his new book, The Nicest Kids in Town, American Bandstand, Rock and Roll, and the Struggle for Civil Rights in 1950s Philadelphia. The show moves from Philadelphia to Hollywood in 1964. How does the show change post-Philadelphia?
Post-Philadelphia, I think the two key things are it's on just once a week once it moves to Los Angeles.
Saturday mornings, yep.
Yeah, Saturday morning. So its cultural influence is still there, certainly, right? It's on until 1989, so it is still part of American culture. But my interest in that Philadelphia era was that it was on every day. So it was such a religious almost experience that teens would come home from school and they would watch it every day. But when it moves to Los Angeles, it's on once a week, and then it becomes more kind of professional or pre-professional dancers. So these are folks who want to get into show business and they're on the show. So it loses some of that neighborhood feel. These are very polished performers. They're not just the everyday teens who come over after they get off of high school. And the last thing, when it moves to Los Angeles, it does become racially integrated regularly then, really without complaint or without issue. By 1964, the context of America is a little bit different, and also because it's not rooted in that specific neighborhood, it's able to do things on television. It's still not an extensively integrated show. There's not a ton of African-American performers on, or dancers on, but you get more of an integrated dance floor by the 1960s.
And I know this is a bit beyond kind of the historical scope of the book, but what impact does, say, a show like Soul Train have on Dick Clark thinking about what his project is? I know they did a little kind of Soul Train version offshoot, as a way to compete, but how aware was he of Soul Train and its success in that regard?
Well, he was very, very aware. I mean, as you indicated earlier, Dick Clark was a tremendous business person, right? Tremendous entrepreneur. So he knew all about how to market the show, and he was always aware of where the show needed to go next and where competitors were to the show. So when Soul Train came on, it did start to win away performers, win away advertisers, and win away viewers from American Bandstand. As you indicated, he tried to create a rival show. So his quote was, if there's going to be a black bandstand, I'm going to host the black bandstand. I'm going to build the black bandstand. So he launched a show called Soul Unlimited that was hosted by a black DJ from Los Angeles. And it was only on for a couple of months because Don Cornelius got together with Jesse Jackson actually and pushed ABC to get it off the air, and they were actually successful in that. Where it shows up in my book, though, is that for Dick Clark, Soul Train, when it comes on the air and starts to win away viewers and advertisers, it's the first time he offers up that memory of integrating American Bandstand. So part of my struggle with the project was, how did Dick Clark come to offer up this sort of false memory of integrating American Bandstand? And what I argue is that from 57, when he supposedly integrated it, until the 1970s, he doesn't say anything about it. It's not until Soul Train starts to win away viewers that he needs to come out and make claims that he was an advocate for the African American community as early as the 1950s. So I think it's really interesting how that it's sort of a selective historical memory that's brought on by the competition of Don Cornelius' Soul Train.
Yeah. We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Matthew Delmont, who is Assistant Professor of American Studies at Scripps College in California, and the author of the new book, The Nicest Kids in Town, American Bandstand, Rock and Roll, and the Struggle for Civil Rights in 1950s Philadelphia. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, Matthew.
Thank you, Mark. It's been great.
I love you for sentimental reasons.
I love you, 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 for sentimental reasons. I hope you do believe me. I've given you my.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined this afternoon by Professor John Jennings, a designer, curator, illustrator, cartoonist, and award-winning graphic novelist. He's Associate Professor of Visual Studies at the State University of New York at Buffalo, my own stomping grounds. And he's a founder and contributor of iTrauma Comics. How are you doing today, John?
I'm doing great, Mark. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm so glad to have you on the show.
It's good to be here.
We've been traveling around the country now for almost 2 years, talking about the black image in the American mind. And more recently, as recently, at least as of this taping a week ago in Milwaukee, talking about this in relationship to the murder, the death of Trayvon Martin. For a little bit, to kind of introduce audiences to your work, one of the things that I've come to appreciate about you and your work is this really fascination. I almost want to call you a visual geek, but putting at the forefront the importance of folks developing a visual literacy. This historical knowledge that lets us understand that when we see these images, there's almost nothing new created under the sun. I mean, they're always in conversation with previous images, and these images very often have a very real political and ideological bent to them.
That's right. Well, definitely. I think just coming from a design history background or from a graphic design background is something that's become, I think, very apparent to me. The more and more, every day, it's like a proliferation of images, and I wonder if people have the facility to actually read them. Yeah. I mean, we actually move through, the world being inundated by these images, and I don't know. I think that we're really still fixated on kind of a logocentric idea about what about what literacy is, and the type of literacy is more multimodal, and so we're every day inundated by these other types of images. So we need to learn how to read them. Basically, is what I'm really kind of fixated, as you said. So I definitely do think of myself as a geek to a certain degree too. So, yeah.
One of the things I think is interesting is that when we think about visual culture, whether they're producers of film, television, or if they're doing ads or other kinds of digital media, folks who produce this work make very conscious decisions, right? Make very conscious choices.
Right.
And it raises real questions about when we continue to see these kind of stereotypes and stereotypical references to African American culture, to black folks, that some of this stuff really isn't by accident, right? Even as we expect to hear the apology, somewhere down the road, no, we didn't mean to depict the president as an ape. In some ways, your work suggests that none of this is ever an accident, right? This is always a product of folks making very deliberate choices.
Oh, definitely. I mean, honestly, if you think about it, like airtime and the expense of creating these types of narratives is so expensive that they really can't waste time like trying to make these, these missteps. If you look at, like, for instance, like a DVD, right, we have like the making of the film. You can see the step-by-step process, how much thought process is going into making these particular types of narratives. Or for instance, if you look at something like Lord of the Rings, for instance, they use the pre-visualization process to help cut down on costs because of all the staging and the kind of like just the pre-production process of like making these images. And it's very important. And I think by nature we're very visual creatures, and so this idea of the visual narrative, I think it's part of us. And sometimes I think that because we're inundated by it so much, we're like fish. We don't notice it. Like the fish don't notice the water. We don't really like. We're swimming around in these media images and really don't have the wherewithal to deal with them. So,
what do you think, though, continues to be the value of some of these images, right? Because clearly these are folks who know that there's going to be pushback. I think at the moment, for instance, of all the controversy around Mary J. Blige's Burger King commercial.
Right.
And on the one hand, it's kind of funny and humorous, but what leads a company to decide that this is really the image that we want to put out there at this particular moment, knowing that there's going to be significant pushback?
I wonder if it's about this idea of publicity. Like, there's no such thing as bad publicity, right? I mean, these images have been with us since basically since the beginning of the country, if you think about it that way, as far as like just these images around blackness and around black women. And also these stereotypes, a lot of them are based in truth. Most of them are based in truth. It's just that when they become the only way that you see a person, then it becomes problematic when it starts to create, when it starts to deal with this ideas around public policy and things of that nature, or if it becomes the only like monolithic way of seeing someone. They don't have that much time to get these images across. So stereotypes, they basically relate images really quickly. They speak to an innate connection. They're kind of like cartoons or logos for people, and we respond to those types of like great images, and they become part of our kind of like cultural history, or our cultural creation of meaning, and we respond to them.
We're here with John Jennings. You're watching Left of Black. John Jennings is a designer, curator, illustrator, cartoonist, and award-winning graphic novelist. Also associate professor of visual studies at the State University of New York at Buffalo, and founder contributor of iTrauma Comics. He is also the co-editor with Damian Duffy of Black Comix, African American Independent Comics, Art and Culture, and also The Whole Consumer Culture, which was also done with Damian Duffy. Talk a little bit about what it means to be a black graphic artist at this particular moment. Folks, you think about things like Comic-Con and everybody knows about, you expect to see certain kinds of folks there. Rarely are folks expecting to see black folks there. But in fact, there's a fairly substantial and tight-knit community of folks who have been involved as graphic novelists and graphic artists in general, doing comic books. Of course, there's Jonathan Gale's, great new film about black superheroes that also puts a lot of those folks in the forefront. You're featured in the film. Talk about what it is to do that kind of work and be part of this community, often in obscurity, from everyday black folks. Yeah,
definitely. I think actually one of the most famous black artists was actually, a lot of people thought he was white actually, was George Herriman. He used to do Crazy Cat in the 1920s. And he was actually in the Masters of American Comics, of American Comics show back in 2005. It was an art exhibition. And so, that kind of like space between those different types of narratives, there's been like a long history of like black comics artists in our country. But right now, I think it's really exciting because of just the community that is being built. When Damien and I were doing research for the show that we did, this exhibition called Out of Sequence, Underrepresented Voices in American Comics, we started to do research on basically who was out there outside of the mainstream. And we came across the East Coast Black Age of Comics Convention, which is in Philadelphia every year in May. This year it's on the 18th and 19th in Philadelphia. And that also spawned another convention called OnyxCon, which is August 17th and 18th in Atlanta. And so these Black women and Black men are out there actually making comics and self-publishing them. And basically, Black Comics is a collection of the artwork of these of the work that these people are doing. And we're talking about people who basically will wait tables all day and then go home and make comics, or they're a graphic designer during the day or a teacher during the day, and they'll go home and make comics. Right. And there's
working for Hallmark or something like that, right?
And they travel around, yeah, and sell the comics and actually talk about these images. So,
how did you make this transition into this world? I imagine on some level you're a classically trained artist, right, but decide to really branch out and do different things in this regard. And what's also equally important, that you were able still to find a footing within mainstream traditional academia to be able to do this kind of work.
Well, I think I've always been interested in comics from an early age. So actually, my mom's fault. She actually bought me my first comics. It was a Mighty Thor and Spider-Man and things of that nature. And actually, that's what started me drawing. And I think for a long time I wanted to be a comics illustrator. And then reality set in that everybody wanted to be a comics illustrator. And I actually ended up, getting my undergraduate degree in commercial art, which is the great granddaddy of graphic design. This is like pre-computer.
Right.
So I think I started using it, doing like digital illustration. I want to say like early '90s when the Macintosh was coming into into prominence in the field. And so for a long time I was doing a lot of like freelance work. And I think that when I went back to Jackson State and helped start the graphic design program there, I realized that there was a lot of things that I wanted to do in the academy. And so I ended up getting a position at University of Illinois where while I was doing research on for my tenure case, I became really interested in like just different aspects of Black masculinity, and I started seeing connections of performed masculinity in the comics, and also in wrestling and video games and hip hop, of course, like gangster rap and things of that nature. And I started drawing these conclusions and connections about just how Black masculinity was performed. So, long story short, that kind of drew me back into comics, and then I started becoming really interested in how they were being produced and how they were being executed, how they were being distributed as well, which is fascinating right now because, of course, a lot of the comics are going online and they're actually shifting to printing on demand modes of publishing. So I think the technology has afforded a lot of people who, in the past weren't able to actually have access to those types of like channels to get their work out. And I think now you're going to see like this proliferation of a lot of independent publishers, even more so now. So,
it's almost akin to what we've seen in terms of independent Black filmmakers over the last 20, 25 years. Yeah,
definitely. The access to the technology has helped a great deal. I mean, anyone can actually get a website now, figure out a way to get the computer, the software, and then upload this work and distribute it digitally anywhere in the world. So.
I think about the infamous Black Panther animated cartoon.
Oh, yes.
That BET put in production but never actually aired. But because of things, video on demand channels and things like that, so many people now have had the opportunity to watch it that would not have had access to it before.
I actually have it on DVD. I got it on Amazon. So. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I think that the animation could have been better though. But I think that I really love that character though for a lot of different reasons.
And that's where the technology piece is also different also, because I imagine even for Reggie Hudlin, that if he's not constrained by a half-hour television format, where he can only show these kind of 12-minute segments and what have you, and he's freed up in a different kind of media platform, he could have engaged in much more detail, both in terms of the animation and also in terms of the storyline.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was just thinking about that basically, with this idea of publishing different platforms, you can do a 2 page comic and actually put it out there. You don't have to have these ads sandwiched between the pages. You can do a horizontal comic if you do a square comic if you want to and put it online, or put it out through different distribution channels, you know? And so basically what you go back to is the fact that the narrative drives the story and not necessarily just the commerce, you know, which is great. Because with the webcomics piece, or with a lot of these digital comics, a lot of the revenue, if you are making revenue, is off of the ancillary products like T-shirts and other things that are being generated by people who are just interested in the story, you know.
We're here with John Jennings. You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. John Jennings is an illustrator, cartoonist, award-winning graphic artist. He's also associate professor of visual studies at the State University of New York at Albany, and also a contributor and founder of iTrauma Comics. You mentioned a couple of minutes ago, John, in our conversation, hip-hop. And I always go back to the work of Richard Eiton, political scientist at Northwestern University, and in his book, In Search of the Black Fantastic, he talks about, you know, what was so important about the emergence of hip hop in the way that we know it now is that it also occurred at the same time that there was this kind of explosion of black visuality, if you will. When you think about things like MTV and the breakthrough of crossover stars like Eddie Murphy, Michael Jordan, Michael Jackson, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we think about hip hop now in 2012, you know, we talk a great deal still about lyrics. There's obviously conversation about, you know, what folks are doing around hip hop production. But in some ways, the most lasting aspect of contemporary hip hop culture really is what we're seeing visually. And if you could talk a little bit about what kinds of things you're seeing in contemporary hip hop that are of value in terms of visual culture or detrimental in terms of visual culture at this point.
Oh wow, that's kind of difficult, Mark, actually, because you know, one of the things that I started to see a little bit of when I actually still had cable and actually still didn't watch videos. You know what they say, garbage in, garbage out.
Well, thank God for YouTube, right?
Right, exactly. But the last time I did see some of the videos, I was looking at some of the picking up of the idea of the post-human. Yeah. You know, with stuff like comments, was it Worldwide Underground or Digital? Okay. Yeah. What's the name of it? And it was that's not the name of it.
The album that no one ever wants to remember that comment.
Right. That particular that one song, you know, that was actually pretty decent. I saw this kind of like connection with the idea of technology, kind of like uniting people, and I guess that's kind of like, you know, piggybacking off of some discussions that we're having, and basically. These ideas around they kind of go back to like what African Bambaataa was talking about, was this kind of like, you know, this Planet Rock idea, right, where these particular communities are being connected through hip hop or through, you know, this access to technology. Not necessarily everything. I mean, you can see stuff as far as like the human voice being modulated even more so, like people like T-Pain or Hacker or it's always been this idea of like the extent of technology as an extension of mankind anyway, right? So I can see that being reappropriated even more so in how videos and how you know, how the message is getting out there, and I guess that's positive. A lot of the mainstream hip hop that I was seeing, I really wasn't that into it, I have to admit, but that was the last thing I did see, was this kind of resurgence of the idea of the Afrofuturist kind of tendencies of some of the beginnings of some of the forefathers of hip hop, which I thought was really interesting. And I think that would probably be my analysis, because I still am not sure what to think of people like some people like Nicki Minaj, for instance, which I kind of like a love-hate relationship with, which I think is intentional. Right. I think one of the most controversial folk out there, of course, is Kanye. You know, who again has always embraced this kind of like sci-fi, like full superhero, you know, hip hop hero kind of idea, and the different extrapolations of that. You know, I think also too, I'm probably projecting quite a bit because I'm really interested in the idea of the black speculative, or the idea of, as you call it, you know, the black fantastic. Or we did a show out in Los Angeles called Fantastic Blackness. Right. And so, you know, so I'm really into that idea. So maybe I'm projecting. But,
I mean, speaking of hip hop superheroes, what do you think of this new hologram of holograph of Tupac.
Oh man, I was just thinking about that. Oh, at lunch. I honestly I haven't seen the presentation. I didn't get a chance to watch it yet, but I've been really interested in these intersections between Afrofuturism, or what people have been calling Afrofuturism, and what I've been thinking of as the ethnogothic. So this idea of a kind of like ghost in a machine that's actually kind of stopping. Yeah. Sometimes progressing to the future, And so it seemed kind of eerie to me because people already have turned him into, I guess, to a certain degree, kind of like an Elvis character, right? Because Tupac is still alive kind of thing, right? And so him being like reified in this holographic form, it actually, I think, is this really interesting like liminal event where, we are rewriting history or rewriting the future or doing both simultaneously. And I'm really interested in those ideas of like the black body as a haunted space, and I've been kind of like doing some work in that area as well. So that's what it popped in my head again. And to go back to the Trayvon Martin piece too, I think of that kind of connection is there as well, where you have a young man whose spirit kind of haunted everyone and actually like caused this connection to happen through the technology, even though in the
digital world, absolutely.
Yeah, technically he's literally a spirit now, and is now mostly like it's information, and if you see him like in this white hoodie, it becomes almost like this halo of this kind of spiritual monk of some kind that's connecting people and kind of infects people with these, with this unity to a certain degree, right? And so I see these connections, with Tupac, and also too just because of the dichotomous nature of Tupac's existence too. I mean, that brings to bear like the idea of the doppelganger, right, which is a gothic, trope. So I don't know, because I've been wrestling with a lot of those kind of things. So when I saw that, I was like, oh my goodness, like here he is. He's like he's back. So.
Yeah, one of the things that was really troubling to me watching the footage of Tupac is that he struck me as so 1996. This was the 24-year-old Tupac. I mean, in his gestures, in his movements, and in some ways it forecloses us actually having the real substantive conversation of what Tupac looks like 16 years later. Exactly. Which for me at this point is really the much more important question, right? How would he have developed, and how can we look at how he might develop as a kind of way to signal how other men of his generation and those younger can think about a way going forward. And this performance kind of forecloses it because it really locks us once again on this particular Tupac, from the mid-1990s, who, while incredibly charismatic, was also incredibly problematic at the same time.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. That's a really great point. So technically, he is a ghost. He is a spirit, because when I think about a revenant or like an apparition of some kind, then you talk about like a spirit that's kind of caught in this kind of like traumatic instance that keeps replaying over and over again. Yeah. And this idea of of playback, but this is intentional playback. That's really interesting as far as what you're saying about how it polarizes how we're seeing Tupac, through this particular image or this reified image. It reminds me of this image that I did of Angela Davis. I was doing for the Center for the Study of Political Graphics to honor her, and my gut reaction was to do her with, to do a picture of her with the afro and young and with the fist up and back in the day, so to speak, right? And then my friend Lee Rayford was like, hey, you should really do an image of her in current day, because what you're doing is you're discounting her growth as an individual and as a very important American citizen and as a leader. And so she was absolutely right, and I felt really kind of ashamed because I was polarizing her as as this kind of like old image, but she has this really amazing living spirit. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think that we get really seduced by those particular types of iconic images, and we want to keep seeing them. And so images have a lot of power, and we really need to address that.
We've been joined by Professor John Jennings, who's a professor of visual studies at the State University of New York at Buffalo. He is the founder and contributor of iTrauma Comics, also the co-editor of Black Comics, African American Independent Comics, Arts and Culture with Damian Duffy. Tell me, Professor Jennings, what's next for you, besides traveling all over the country?
Well, actually, I'm settling down a little bit, just a little bit. Let's see. I'm currently working on a project with Nydia Okorafor, who is an award-winning speculative fiction writer. She just won the World Fantasy Award for her latest novel, Who Fears Death, or her last novel, Who Fears Death. And so I'm adapting a piece for her. I'm also working on a new graphic novel that's set in the 1930s in Bronzeville that actually received a Humanities Institute Award from the University of Buffalo to actually work on, which I'm very excited about. And so I'm going to be working on that in the next few months. And the last thing is a two-man show with my friend Stacy Black Star Robinson. It's called Black Kirby, which is looking at the connections between Jewish American comics creators and African American comics creators.
Right, Jack Kirby, the cartoonist, yeah.
That's right, Jack Kirby, the cartoonist, exactly. It was just kind of looking at the connections between those particular experiences through the comics medium. So if you want to, you can think of it as like an Afro-futurist Black power fantasy through Jack Kirby's lens, that kind of thing. So that launches in September at Jackson State University, and we're hoping to get it to travel. There's been some interest in like having it travel across the nation, and that's just a few of the projects, but there's plenty of things, plenty of things.
Well, thanks for joining us this afternoon, John.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. I had a great time. So.
Take care.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.